Hi, everybody. So very excited about this. Just before we get going, I just want to make sure that all the panelists have their videos switched on, just so that we are actually able to see each other and be spotlighted. That would be very helpful. Okay, great. Well, so I'll do a very quick introduction. So the idea of this panel is to essentially provide an opportunity to zoom out of these individual, specific and brilliant talks that we've had, and consider from a, say, more abstract level the fundamental challenges in DeFi, and yeah, perhaps also consider from sort of first principles what we're trying to build here, and how it's going, essentially. So we have about 45 minutes. The idea is that I will allocate about 15 minutes to Q&A at the end. So yeah, you're very free to ask a question live in that 15 minutes. Or if you would like, alternatively, if you put it in the chat, then I will try to ask it on your behalf in the final 15 minutes. So, okay, I think without any more intro from me, I will kindly ask the speakers, panelists, if they would go. So I guess let's go alphabetically. So perhaps Tarun, you would be able to start.
Hey, I'm Tarun. I actually was a co-author on the first paper today, but I also have a company called Complet, and we kind of do risk assessments in DeFi.
Awesome. Thanks very much. And then Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert Leshner. I'm the founder of Compound. It's an interest rate marketplace built on the Ethereum blockchain.
Thanks very much. Andrew.
Hey, I'm an assistant professor at UIUC in Illinois. I've done a bunch of research on consensus protocols, smart contract programming languages, and applied cryptography. And recently I've been doing work with Zcash and with Chainlink.
Awesome. And Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Musighi, head of growth at Balancer Labs. Balancer is a DeFi protocol for programmable liquidity.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much, and thanks all for joining. Really, yeah, excited about this and hoping we can have a great discussion. So I thought to start, something that's been bugging me a bit recently is about audits. Yeah, we see that there are very many hacks in the DeFi space. And often it's the case that even code contracts that have been audited are still subject to many exploits, etc. So I'm very keen to hear what your thoughts are about the audit process, how much value audits bring, and if there's some way we could iterate towards a better system. So yeah, perhaps if anyone wants to go, or I can direct. Okay.
I'll jump in, and I'll probably start by explaining what an auditor would tell you. So an auditor would tell you that security audits complement the work that the engineering team has already done. And if an engineering team has best practices where they're, thinking through risks as they build and design, if they're, using a lot of test cases, if they're doing, their own, attempts at, the verification of certain functions, audits complement that. If an engineering team isn't focused on best practices, they're focused on, pumping out code and shipping it to auditors as fast as possible and hoping that auditors find the issues, there's not much to do. And, auditors will also say that the amount of time spent on an audit is incredibly important. These are not like Boolean, yes or no's, has an audit been completed. It's a function of how much time has been spent analyzing the system, analyzing, the intent, analyzing all the different surface areas for risk, et cetera. So with that being said, I think the industry has evolved from one of deep skepticism that smart contracts even work at all. So when we started Compound in 2017, there was 3 spectacular meltdowns already. You know, there was the DAO, there was the parity multi-sig CAC, and there was the parity multi-sig CAC, you know, by the time we ever shipped to production. And teams at this point moved incredibly slowly because there was not the expectation that smart contracts even worked to secure funds or can be trusted. And so, you know, the process was to spend months on design, months on building carefully, and then months auditing and testing. And today, we don't see those practices played out as often. It's a team rushing to write code and rushing to ship it to auditors, and auditors rushing to analyze what they've been given. So, you know, I would say that audits are incredibly important, but they're not the only line of defense. You know, in writing code that's supposed to be correct, the onus is always on the team to, you know, be the first and last line of defense. And I think that gets lost in the conversation where communities view audits as a check mark, you know, and that doesn't even remotely begin to tell the story.
Awesome. Yeah.
To me, what's been perplexing about you know, the approach towards security, and I don't have the answer for this, but I want to draw the kind of connection to what we saw in you know, ICOs earlier in the smart contract space. There's a fear of missing out. If you wait until the audit has already come back and all of the testing has been done and the formal model's been made, then you've missed out on the, you know, great opportunity of getting in before anyone knew whether it would work or not. And so I can't wrap my mind around kind of which of 2 alternative narratives fit the best. So one narrative is that this is a systemic risk. So it's everyone's problem if insecure smart contracts that attract a lot of attention lead to a lot of losses, and it leads to a negative, you know, look on the space as a whole, and then it's very bad, and it's everyone's problem that this continues. The other competing narrative that I can't quite reconcile is that if you jump in early because you invest in a smart contract that's launched before adequate testing's been done, then it's your own fault when there ends up being a bug and everything's been drained from it. It almost counters that and says, well, the you know, people participating also have a duty to check whether some adequate testing has been done. It doesn't fall squarely on the team, and everyone's kind of partially responsible. And I don't quite know how to reconcile those. It seems very similar to what's happened in the ICO space several years ago, although there's been quite a lot of evolution since then, so things may have changed.
I think another angle to look at audits is there perhaps might be turning into this sort of like class division in DeFi, because there's a supply and demand issue where there's so much demand for like audits, and there are so few like really great auditors in the space, and the prices are kind of going up higher and higher, so they're not accessible to sort of all of the teams that are getting into the space. And if we come to a point where, you know, I think today audits are probably viewed, as Robert mentioned, like as more like they're relied upon more than they should by the public, but they are still a crucial step. So I think that, you know, if teams are stuck in a position where they can't get those audits because of the cost, or they can't get the audits from the firms that like matter, then it becomes a barrier to entry into the space.
One thing I guess I want to add is from the last during the last ICO boom, there was this huge kind of, I'd say, academic push towards formal languages as the solution to this, and kind of having formal verification and auditing being kind of a drop-in solution. I think, of course, we've kind of learned that that's not totally the case, especially in DeFi, where contract-to-contract interactions and unexpected state transitions due to kind of like global variables versus local state variables is hard to control. When I think global, I mean the Uniswap price, for instance. And also because people keep innovating in terms of new types of things like flash loans and flash minting, which completely change the threat model, which means you have to rewrite all of your formal verification. And so I think, you know, one of the narratives of the last boom was that this would be the panacea, we wouldn't need auditors, and so far it's proven to strictly mean we've needed auditors and more. So I just maybe wanted to point out that I think the programming language side is not always the panacea it's sold as. And this has happened in other industries where people really want to use formal methods, and in production, the only things that ever get formally verified are JavaScript V8 and Excel. And Excel took Microsoft Microsoft Research, who has a lot of resources, like 4 years plus to do that. And that's how Z3 came, was like their formal verification of Excel. So I think like one thing to remember is I don't think it's a purely technical solution that will make them more accessible.
I guess a related point, and coming on to another topic, is that of course DeFi systems are very complex, and the interactions between smart contracts can be quite difficult to foresee ahead of time. One of the talks that we had earlier in the session by Victor von Wachter looked at how there are, I think, 4 times as many transactions with wrapped USDC as opposed to just bare USDC. And I think this, of course, is like reminiscent of some of the trouble in 2008, related to CDOs, etc. I think one interesting question is whether DeFi is growing in complexity and perhaps growing so fast that it's likely to suffer the same fate, either within its own ecosystem or potentially even affecting the rest of finance, as far as it's acceptable to make that distinction. So yeah, very interested to hear thoughts on that.
I'll jump in first. So the composability of DeFi is by far its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The fact that anyone can deploy a contract that's callable and accessible by any other contract is a superpower. It's magical. Contrast this to the legacy financial system where everything is closed off and everything is siloed. The ability for any developer to build a system that uses your contracts is truly revolutionary and transformative. But this is also its greatest weakness. And when I think about composability, I think of low-level systems that rely on nothing else. And then I think of systems that rely on 1 or 2 other base contracts. And then I think of systems that rely on many different systems. There's systems right now where, they're a yield-bearing system, and the yield comes from this giant pyramid of contracts. And if something goes wrong in any one contract in this giant pyramid, it can destroy all of the value built above it. And so when you think of this as like, money Legos, if one Lego beneath you disappears, it potentially jeopardizes every single Lego above it. This can come from the assets being used, right, which are extremely base layer. Stable coins have risks. Collateralized, decentralized stable coins have risk. All of the assets which are mintable have risks. So you have all of these assets, any one of which themselves is a potential liability. Then you have low-level systems that only make use of these assets, like Compound. And then you have higher level systems where you're building things that like send assets all over the place. And so I do think we're building a system that is genuinely already more complex than the legacy financial industry. But that's offset by transparency, where everybody has complete visibility into what's happening and why it's happening. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone is a professional grade auditor themselves, but at least we as a community have complete transparency into every single component of the system. So it is more complex, it is potentially more risky, but if done correctly, it's more transparent and safer. And so I think we're in a discovery phase where sort of, we're learning what works and what doesn't work as a sort of industry. And we're going to emerge with systems that are robust and transparent. And I'm extremely optimistic.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Robert really hit it on the head. I would just add one piece of color to that, which is in the 2008 sort of financial crisis. One of the big problems was that Wall Street firms did not definitively know how much exposure they had to like certain areas of risk in the system, which, as Robert mentioned, is somewhat alleviated by the transparency of DeFi.
Yeah, I guess to that point, a lot of the this is not legal advice, but if we view a lot of the things in crypto as securities or securities that have a price, there's an idea that the true price of the asset should reflect all the known information of the market, right? And I actually think in a lot of illiquid parts of finance, that's never really true. And that in 2008, that was really one of the craziest things, where banks were sold off their exposure, and they might actually have had hundreds of foreclosed houses in Florida that they didn't know were part of security they were selling. Which kind of can't happen in DeFi, where like the asset pricing, I mean, it can if it's something that relies on a lot of off blockchain information, but if you minimize the surface area for off-chain information, then the precise pricing that goes into the price of a security is kind of made clear and instant. And there's this latency difference between the normal financial market, where you do have to wait for certain counterparties to react in order to get kind of information priced into the price of a security that you just don't have here. So the transparency also, I think a lot of the problems we found are because people aren't used to the high latency for what are usually quite illiquid instruments. Or sorry, low latency, as in really fast.
If I could pose a follow-up question to Tarun and just the crew in general, if DeFi activity begins to significantly move onto layer 2 and like other layer 1 side chains, does that present this type of risk that you are talking about, Tarun? Risk of like off-chain activity that is not as clearly visible.
Yeah, for sure. I think it depends on the design, but I definitely agree that that certainly could happen if there's too much kind of like, you're trying to make this, we're trying to take the synchronous system on Ethereum, turn it into an asynchronous system in some manner, shape, or form, whether it's via something that has shards, whether it's via something that has many interacting chains, each with their own sort of performance characteristics and sort of economic security guarantees. But at the very least, you at least have some proofs of state transition being made onto the chain. So I'm in the long run, I think, optimistic rollups are really just a crutch. I think they definitely are, from an engineering standpoint, are going to be super important. But I do think zero knowledge based systems will be able to provide a lot more certainty to the asset pricing in these systems. It's just that we're just not there yet, right? This is like 1980s x86 chip is the way we write zero knowledge programs right now. It's, the fact that we talk about writing gates and compiling things to gates is just, I mean, that no JavaScript developer is like, well, how do I compile my program to like a series of gates?
I'd love to.
And so I think it'll get there, is what I'm saying. I think zero knowledge proofs are really the panacea, but they're kind of the 20-year horizon panacea.
Yeah, I'd love to bring up this topic of privacy and how it relates to this. I think that what we're seeing in DeFi designs right now is that it's it's the radical shift to transparency, much more transparency than you see in centralized finance. That's a big enabling new thing, as it promises to reduce this information asymmetry and lower barriers to entries. It has all of these good qualities, but I think primarily things are transparent by default right now because that is the easiest way to program. It's much more difficult to build privacy into such systems. I think that there's clearly good reasons to desire more confidentiality and privacy in such systems, and we know that the techniques are roughly there and available in the form of zero knowledge proofs, as well as other MPC and trusted hardware and a variety of other techniques as well. So I mean, I think that there will be a shift where once we come to terms with the booming complexity, even in the transparent DeFi world, we'll have even more opportunity to explore complexity in the design space when you have the full available, you can do as much selective disclosure or fine-grained disclosure rules as you want. So I think that there will be there's no reason to think that the transparent by default will always be characteristic of DeFi moving forward as people come to grips with how to do development with fancy cryptography.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that point and related to this topic of privacy generally, I think it is a sort of interesting question whether the fact that all DeFi at the moment is transparent by default is imposing a sort of shadow constraint on how far it can grow before certain types of use become not viable because like they require privacy more or less. Many commercial transactions, for example, the secrecy surrounding the transactions is central to the transaction, and many personal transactions as well. I think it's Ian Myers who has this quote about Bitcoin being like Twitter for your bank account, which I remember hearing at FC last year, and it stuck with me. I would put the question to everybody whether this is like the elephant in the room or if there's no elephant. If anyone,
I think it is a.
Okay.
There could be multiple
Sure.
elephants.
I think it is definitely an elephant, but I think the thing is like the nature of DeFi, like firstly is to bring transparency to an economic sector that has been so obscure. And I think that, privacy is so hard in DeFi because of the crucial role that transparency plays and sort of the danger of becoming more like CeFi when privacy is added into DeFi.
Yeah,
I'll take the other side real quick, and I'll say, transparency is a byproduct. I personally think that the reason for this to exist is the autonomy of financial markets and products that we can create that don't require, manual processes and interventions and like all of these things, which, by the way, it creates amazing transparency. But I think like more of the root purpose in my mind, at least what got me into this originally was like, hey, we can have systems that just run on their own. And, some people like the unstoppability of things, like they're censorship resistant or whatever. Not everything has to be like, completely permanently autonomous, but like building systems that just work, right? And work predictably, that, other people can build on top of. And they don't have to be fully transparent. I can see a system like Compound where all of the individual user balances are completely opaque, but that the markets themselves tie out, the aggregate balances and things like that. That might be a far superior system where you can like inspect the totals, but not the individual users. So we'll see. I mean, we're also in like chapter 2 of DeFi, and I think it's a long book.
Yeah, absolutely.
One other thing actually to Andrew's comment in the chat. So yeah, one thing I think that maybe from the design side that people kind of haven't grappled with is that most of the mechanisms that have worked in DeFi have worked because they sort of have taken things that exist in the real world and added kind of these compute complexity constraints to them. And these computational complexity constraints, unfortunately, are not necessarily sort of computational complexity designs, like things like Uniswap, where you have this convex program, are unfortunately not exactly compatible with privacy. And so actually the same authors of the paper that we presented today, we actually wrote a paper last week showing that you can de-anonymize Uniswap quantities from the timing and trading behavior, even if you're using a zero knowledge proof. So I think one thing people need to remember is it's not just money Lego plus ZKP equals freedom. It's actually quite a bit of the mechanism actually has to not be leaking side channel information. And there also has to be sort of a some notion of privacy awareness built into the DeFi mechanisms. And I think that's a very large area of research. And it's an area of research that kind of is in my mind, a new part of cryptography that kind of extends differential privacy to DeFi. So I think like that from an academic standpoint, that is going, in my mind, the biggest area of research for DeFi over the next couple of years.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, I'll move along to the next question. So maybe digging a bit deeper on one specific issue is surrounding governance in DeFi. So one of the main challenges is that with decentralized governance, governors with the governance token can vote on system parameters, change them quite easily, potentially change them in ways that affect where the value in the system goes to, depending on the sort of cash flows that are coming in. It might make sense for governors to take decisions that are not directly in the interest of the protocol itself, but are instead in sort of their own interest. So what, I mean, this seems like a fairly fundamental challenge, and also with like governance tokens themselves, the kind of region under which it makes sense for governors to do different things depends on the price of the token often. So if the token loses value, maybe different behaviors make sense. So yeah, the question is there any sort of neat solution to this problem, or should it be seen as one of the hard problems in the DeFi setting, or is this just a sort of a misnomer? If anyone wants to go, please jump in. Otherwise, I will do some type of alphabetical selection.
Well, I thought you kind of got me thinking with this idea of the interest of the token holder being separate from the interest of the protocol. And I guess the way I would frame that in my mind is maybe it's a short-term versus long-term thing where the token holder might be more driven or more prone to want to make decisions that increase short-term value of the token as opposed to investing in the long-term building of value for the protocol.
I agree with that completely. I don't think this problem is unique to governance of a protocol. Like you see the exact same conversations occurring with like, existing financial markets and like stock and corporate governance, like when the value of the governance stock is super low, the corporation does crazy shit, right? None of these concepts are that new, and I don't think it's a totally different field of research. I think it's, unique because there's more liquid democracy and ability to manage. So like individual token holders can truly change the operation of a protocol or system in ways that shareholders individually cannot have influence over. There is more of a separation between owners and boards and managers in traditional financial markets. But, I think a lot of the incentives are very similar between them. I think it's possible that more direct action is a blessing. It's possible that it adds more complexity and is a negative. But I think the problem set and the incentives are very similar between old and new.
Governance is interesting to me because it's like a very different kind of a model and problem framing than just like auctions and mechanisms. So typically governance you discuss for like political economy and collective decision making, but you don't analyze a voting structure exactly the same way you analyze an auction with very explicit like incentives. So I almost think that it's likely that is almost like two facets of any application is going to have one facet that is strictly incentive driven, and then another facet that is something other than incentive driven. And if we can model or analyze it, it would take something other than what we use for modeling the auctions and mechanisms.
Cool. I think at this point, it might be nice to open this up to everyone in the chat to ask questions. So yeah, if anyone wants to ask a question live, feel free to do so. If not, I will ask questions from the chat, and I have a couple of others as well. So yeah, does anyone want to ask anything?
Yeah, I've asked in the chat as well. So the first topic was auditors. So the question is, should auditors have skin in the game in the protocols they audit? Your thoughts on that?
I'll jump in and say absolutely not. And I think because it will crowd out auditors who will refuse to take those risks. Their business is complementing a team's best practices. They can't be held responsible for every possible thing that's unimaginable. I mean, there's also a massive difference between 1 week of work and 4 and 8 and 16. It's possible that just the cost of engaging an auditor will become even more absurdly prohibitively expensive if you require them to take on liability as well. They might only audit for 20 weeks, instead of like 4 weeks if they have to take on certain risks. So I think the market can solve this. I think requiring it or expecting it is, backwards and will, lead to worse outcomes.
To give a comp to the normal market, cybersecurity. So I made the folly 10 years ago trying to start a cybersecurity insurer. So I can tell you, it's a very weird business between auditors and insurers in cybersecurity, which is probably the closest analog you have to DeFi, because basically, I think things like GDPR basically forced a lot of companies to buy insurance. And you actually have this very weird relationship where the auditors contract the insurers contract the auditors, and that sort of sets the price, and that's legally mandated in a bunch of jurisdictions. And so I think there's historical precedent that by forcing auditors to also be insurers, you get some very weird conflicts of interest in the cybersecurity domain, and so it's actually regulated to be separate. So I think that might be a good place of historical vestige and interest to understand that.
Do you think there's a need or the potential to basically encourage more auditors to show up, make it easier to become an effective auditor?
I would have hoped programming language theory, the idealist in me would have hoped it's like, oh yeah, everyone's writing, like in a programming language that doesn't have jump dest accidentally compiled 500 times into it. But it's like JavaScript. We're just kind of stuck until the tools get better, but the tools will get better. It took 15 years for JavaScript's developer tools and environment to really, really get to the point that someone in a coding boot camp could write JavaScript, right? And so I think it's just the developer tools and ecosystem over time will eventually make it much easier to be an auditor and other things.
Cool. Someone else have a question they would like to ask live?
I have a bunch of more questions if nobody wants to take it.
Well,
it's nice to go for it.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so a question for everybody, but for Robert specifically. There's an interesting quirk that the market cap of CDAI is larger than the market cap of DAI, or at least it has been at some point. Your thoughts on that, on specifically this connects to formal verification, like has this been something you accounted for and thought of, like what happens when everybody wants to take their DAI back and there's not enough to go around? How does this settle in the grand scheme of things?
Well, it's the exact same mechanic as the central bank to commercial banks. So, if a central bank lends $10 to a bank, and that bank goes out and gives it to person B, who then deposits it back into a different bank, there's a money multiplier. And, just through the act of, borrowing or lending, you increase the amount of effective money in the economy. It's the exact same thing here. You could have an asset, but there's only 10 of them. And a market like Compound, you could have 1,000 of them borrowed and 1,000 of them supplied to the protocol as well, right? If you have reserve requirements and things like this, and you sort of enforce, certain ratios, then you can bring it down or bring it up. But it works the exact same way as central banking to commercial banking. So I don't think it's necessarily a problem as long as each user or each address has to play by sort of the same collateral requirements as any other.
Awesome.
I have another question. I think that ties in nicely into this.
Please.
Still for Robert. So you have zombie debts, right, on Compound and Aave as well. So the collateral value is too low for anyone to ever pay them back. Do you write them off? What do you do from the accounting point of view? Or are they just like assets, fictitious assets in a way?
Yeah, I mean, there's essentially none on Compound. What's cool is the system is totally transparent. You can go to app.compound.finance/liquidate to see, every possible address that has more debt than borrowing capacity. There's not that many. It adds up to a couple of $1,000s in aggregate, which, the reserves of the system, grow exponentially faster than that. And it's really also just a function of gas costs, in that if gas costs go back down to zero, people would liquidate these again. So you have users that have borrowed $100 and it costs $30 to liquidate them. So no one's going to do it, that are years old, right? No new users want to borrow something, borrow a small amount because the gas costs are so high. So really what happens is they are just like negligible. There could always be a system later that just, zaps them gone. And then the protocol just, accounts for it. But they're so small that I don't think anyone's put the time into building a system to take them off the books yet. In aggregate, it adds up to like a couple of $1,000s when there's $10 million of reserves in the protocol. Plus, the governance can allocate and oversee about $2 billion of comp. So I think it's a small enough and negligible problem that just no one has spent time on it.
Thanks. Okay. And
I think we're sort of coming up to time. I think it might be good to just go with one final question, perhaps if everyone would like to give some response to this, and then maybe we wrap things up. So it's just a question about what the kind of end game is for DeFi. So in 10 years' time, what is it possible to form any predictions on what the situation might look like, and is the aim to recreate existing finance just on chain, or what's the kind of the vision in 10 years? So it's
I think, like, to set the stage to answer that question, it's like any kid who can write smart contract code can build financial applications now. And like, I think the barrier to entry in finance has been dramatically lowered by DeFi. So, this power used to basically belong to, like, strictly to Wall Street banks, which meant that they kind of had this monopoly over shaping financial products and services. And so there's a fresh perspective coming into finance. And I think, like, the wide array of people who are building financial applications now are going to also create a very wide array of, like, different types of products and services. So I expect to see a very, very different, financial landscape as a result of DeFi.
Tarun, perhaps?
Yeah. I think that the analog for DeFi shouldn't be like, hey, we're replacing banks, as much as it's like sort of how electronic trading changed trading venues and brokers, and kind of a lot of third parties that got disintermediated by basically, like, competition in making certain assets more liquid, and also making derivatives more available. And I think the end game is really to make those a lot cheaper to access, and also disintermediate markets that are illiquid, but that are illiquid not for reasons of free marketness, but actually for reasons of cruft, and no one wants to rebuild the database.
It'll sound silly, but I think we should set our sights much further, in that in 10 or maybe 20 years, like, we've entirely transformed society in an unrecognizable way, all because of stuff that starts in DeFi. I'm really interested in the ideas of, like, personal tokens, and the idea of basically encouraging people to form groups, to form ad hoc relationships with strangers over the internet, and essentially make these all economically impactful. So yeah, I think the best analogy is to the forming of the internet. It's changed ways that we interact with each other in ways that are kind of unimaginable by just using mail as an analogy. So my hope is that we've seen nothing yet, and we see some, bigger departures from the concepts, and recreating finance a little faster and see some more transformative things.
I think it's going to lead to a golden era and a utopia for just finance and economics. There's going to be obviously some ups and downs and bumps along the way, but we're entering into a future in which finance is completely robotic and it's not managed by humans. And I think we're going to have just faster, cheaper, safer, better systems. Obviously there's going to be some crashes along the way, but we're going to build a system I think that most people don't even think about, and that's cool. I think the end goal in my mind is that everything is running on a DeFi stack one day, and most people don't know or care. Just like they don't know or care how the internet works, just that it works, and it's delightful.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think we should probably wrap up at this point. I'm not sure if there's any way to do a sort of virtual round of applause. I don't think there is. So I apologize on behalf of Zoom.
Everyone hit your reactions
everyone
button.
can do the reaction button.
Clap
That's
emoji.
great.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. But yeah, thanks very much, everyone, particularly 4 panelists for joining. I hope this has been an interesting and useful discussion.